Hello, I'm Mark Fisher, Professor of Neurology at UC Irvine and Director of the UCI Center for Neuropolitics. And I want to welcome you to our spring event, today's lecture, titled The Havana Syndrome, a disorder of neuropolitics. The UCI Center for Neuropolitics was established in 2021 to provide novel insights into the great contemporary political issues by drawing from expertise in neurology, neuroscience, and political science. And today's lecture addresses the puzzling Havana Syndrome, a topic directly at the interface of these disciplines. Is the Havana Syndrome a true neuropolitical disorder? That is it a neurological illness manufactured for political purposes? We are honored to have as our guest speaker today, Dr. Robert Baloh, Emeritus Professor of Neurology at UCLA. Dr. Baloh has had an extraordinary career as the world's leading authority in the discipline of neurotology, a subspecialty focusing on disorders that produce symptoms of dizziness, vertigo, and hearing loss. He has written 14 books and more than 350 peer-reviewed articles over the course of 50 years. He has received many awards and trained more than 40 fellows in neurotology. And today, Dr. Baloh will bring his vast expertise to discuss the Havana Syndrome. We invite you, the audience, to send in questions to Dr. Baloh using the Q&A feature on your Zoom connection. And the discussion will be led by my colleague and center co-director, Dr. Geffen Phoenix, Associate Professor of Political Science at UC Irvine. And by the way, while questions for Dr. Baloh are welcome, please hold any medical questions you might have if you are experiencing dizziness or vertigo. So now, let's please welcome Professor Bob Baloh.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate the introduction, and I hope I can live up to your expectations. So I'm going to talk about Havana Syndrome. I plan on starting with an overview, just to bring everybody up to speed. It's going to be a fairly rapid overview with some of the key details, and then I plan on addressing some of the common questions that I get asked about Havana Syndrome. When I've interviewed about it, I've been interviewed on numerous occasions by various parts of the news media, and hopefully I'll be able to fill in the holes of the more brief overview with answering the questions later on. And then I will address some examples that have occurred in the past, depending on how much time I have left. I'm a history buff, I've always been. There's just some fascinating stories of similar phenomena that have happened in the past, but I'll have only a short time to get into that. But let's start with the first slide in my overview. So very late in 2016, and then on and through first 5 or 6 months of 2017 is when most of the initial action took place in Cuba. At that time, embassy employees and family members began showing up at the embassy staff clinic with a whole range of different symptoms. And many of them reported that the symptoms began after they heard some strange sounds. Now, the symptoms were, as I say, very variable, from headache, even migraine headaches, dizziness, tinnitus, ringing in the ears, pressure in the ears, pain in the ears. Some reported cognitive problems, brain fog, difficulty concentrating, trouble with memory. The problem was there was not a very clear pattern, and there was much variability in the different groups of symptoms. Now, the sounds were even more confusing in that people reported different types of sounds. The most common was a high-pitched buzzing, but others reported lower-pitched sounds. The sounds could be right before the symptoms in some cases. Others, the symptoms developed hours, even days after the sounds. Very unusual features. The sounds could occur in a room where another person in the same room would not hear the sounds. Person could get up and walk about to other parts of the home and either hear the sounds louder or not hear the sounds at all. And the descriptions of the sounds varied in terms of the intensity, but none of them reported excruciatingly loud or bothersome sounds from the loudness point of view. So obviously this was a problem for the staff at the clinic, what exactly was going on. As I'll get into, there was reports that the symptoms likely were due to some type of attack. They, in fact, initially they were called health attacks because patients would report having the sound and having symptoms. And that term was used frequently initially. Now, at this point, you have this complicated picture of patients coming in with a variety of symptoms. Could they be experiencing some type of an attack from some type of a sonic weapon, which was suggested? One might question, well, why not bring in a group of experts, say from the CDC, to study this in its initial phase? Ideally in this kind of a situation where there's a concern for some type of exposure and people developing symptoms from such an exposure, you'd like to interview the initial cases. You'd like to have a very detailed assessment of how the symptoms began, how they evolved, exactly what was occurring in the community. Of course, it's the same time interviewing and examining people around who didn't have the symptoms, weren't exposed as a control group. But none of this was done. There was nothing like this done. What was done, as I'll be showing you, is that the people were the ones that were complaining of significant symptoms were sent on to an ENT physician at the University of Miami, Dr. Michael Hoffer, and I'll be getting into that in some detail. But there was no careful study in the sense of looking at people who were and were not exposed. Now, interestingly, several months after this initial reports of attacks, an investigative journalist, actually Tim Golden, who Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist, went into Cuba and attempted to do a careful examination of the initial attacks. He interviewed several dozen of the embassy employees. Identified some of the very first few people that were complaining of symptoms and tried to put together exactly what happened. As it turned out, for about the last month in 2016, there were rumors going about of some sounds being heard, some strange sounds. No one complained of any symptoms or illness at that time, but there were rumors of such sounds occurring. At the very end of 2016, the first person to present to the clinic, to the embassy clinic, was an intelligence agent who complained of headache, ear pain, and some problems with hearing. And he described hearing a a strange sound, which he described as a beam of sound right before he developed the symptoms. Now, subsequently, then several other people, the first three were all intelligence agents, CIA agents, who reported having heard sounds and having had symptoms. And according to one of the agents that was interviewed, the initial case, the initial person, began lobbying and even, if not coercing, people to report symptoms and to connect the dots between the sound, the strange sounds that were being heard, and the actual dizziness. Now, this is pretty much the only information we have about these early cases, which are often very important in this type of a scenario. And I'll be coming back to that later on. Now, one of the interesting things, too, is the attacks all occurred at the residence of the employees, or in two of the major hotels where employees stayed, particularly those who weren't married. No attacks occurred at the embassy. And there were no attacks reported by any, or no symptoms or descriptions of episodes by Cubans in the neighborhoods or any other people in the neighborhood initially. Now, in the early stage, these CIA agents went to the head of the American diplomatic mission there, Jeffrey De Laurentiis, and indicated that they were concerned that there was some type of an attack occurring, and they thought that the Cubans were responsible for the attack. And they did convince him that this was a possibility. And in early part of 2017, in March, he actually called a meeting of embassy employees and discussed the issue, telling them about the sounds and the fact that people had been having symptoms, and told them that they should be on the alert if they heard any kind of sounds and if they had any types of symptoms, and that they should immediately report them to the embassy clinic staff. Now, what is interesting is the first actual information to the public, and the first time that there was a release of information to the general public, occurred in August of 2017. So this is already after, by this time, some 80 people had reported symptoms, and many of them had already been referred on to a physician in Miami that I had mentioned. This was sort of a common referral route. And they presumably picked an ENT physician because of the sound and having ear symptoms. But it was actually a press, State Department press conference that reporters asked that they had been hearing about such things. They had been hearing about possible health attacks and employees having symptoms. And indeed, for the first time, the State Department spokesman indicated, yes, these attacks have been occurring. It was not completely clear what was going on, but that such things were occurring. And it was not very long, of course, that then reports start showing up in the press and in the media, as I'll get into shortly. Now, already in March of 2017, the United States warned Cuba about these attacks, and they sent expelled two Cuban embassy employees from the United States at that time, along with the warning. Later in the year, after this press release, a few months later, they expelled another 15 Cuban employees in the United States, and started to cut the size of the U.S. Employees in Cuba. Now, of course, the Cubans were in a difficult situation. You're aware that, I mean, during the late years of the Obama administration, the relationships were starting to thaw somewhat with Cuba. People were allowed to go to Cuba, visit Cuba. There were some plane flights in and out of Cuba that were allowed. And of course, Cuba was very anxious to improve relations with the U.S., mainly because of money and the money that the tourists and other people visiting could bring. And so this was rather, from that point of view alone, it was rather strange. Why would the Cuban government be doing this whenever they were in a situation where it could only harm them at the time? And in fact, that's what they told, of course, the U.S. government whenever they were warned about these attacks. But they immediately set up their own investigation, a committee that of top scientists to look into it whenever they were warned in March of 2017. And many of these were scientists that were known to U.S. scientists. Even some had collaborated with U.S. scientists, but they were asked to find out what was going on. They interviewed many people. They did soil samples, blood samples of various toxins, tried to find evidence of what the sounds could be. Interestingly, they invited the FBI to come in and conduct an independent investigation, saying that they would let them have access to anything they wanted, and indeed they did. The FBI did go in and conduct an investigation. And as I'll be showing you, and interestingly, the results of that were not released by the government, but there were various releases from anonymous sources suggesting what the results of that investigation were. But the bottom line is the FBI could not find any evidence of any type of attack at the time. Now, as I said, about this time, late in 2017, is when really the media frenzy began. Headlines all over the country, New York Times, Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, of sonic attacks, mysterious weapons, covert devices, Cubans attacking American diplomats. The interesting thing about these media reports, including many on the social media and on TV, were clear that there were attacks occurring. It wasn't a question of whether there were attacks. There were attacks, and they were occurring, and the Cubans were felt to be responsible. Also, of a lot of anonymous source type information in these reports, because there was so little official data being released, but these anonymous reports kept being released. One of them was that there was many of the victims of these attacks suffered severe hearing loss. This was in several reports. Another report, and again a leak from some physicians who later examined them and did report on the examinations, that they had damage to white matter tracts in the brain. And there were repeated comments that there was brain damage documented. The doctors had documented brain damage in these victims. So as I mentioned earlier, the initial sequence was a referral to an ENT physician at the University of Miami, Dr. Michael Hoffer, who had ties with the military. He had been in the military, and there's a whole long history of the relationship with that, and I won't go into it, but the point is that was a common referral pattern. So in these months, about 80 different people who complained of symptoms were sent on to Miami to be examined by Dr. Hoffer and his group. And then Dr. Hoffer identified a group of patients that he at least initially thought may have had brain injury or possible brain trauma, something like a concussion, based on the symptoms of memory difficulties, brain fog, some reporting confusion, a variety of even memory loss in some, as I mentioned. So he sent them on to the University Brain Trauma Center at the University of Pennsylvania for detailed studies there. And I'll get into some detail regarding the results of these studies a little later on. But at this point, this was occurring. The referral was occurring. Now, another interesting thing happened at the end of 2017 when reports came out that Canadian MSC employees were also reporting attacks and presenting to their medical clinic. Now, this was even stranger because, of course, Canada had very good relations with Cuba. In fact, when it was not possible to fly from the United States to Cuba, many Americans went to Canada and then flew from Canada. And there was always a good working relationship between Canada and Cuba. So the reason why Cubans would want to attack Canadian MSC employees was even stranger than attacking American employees. The first case there was, again, fairly well documented. It was a neighbor of one of the American families that had developed symptoms and had reported attacks. The neighbor didn't have the symptoms until a few weeks later, and it was clear that the Americans and the Canadians were socializing a great deal and a lot of interactions, and that they had been talking about this syndrome. And it turns out there were actually 14 Canadians who were then sent home complaining of symptoms, and 5 of them hired attorneys, and then so they were suing the Canadian government because they did not properly protect them. That suit is still pending. What is interesting is that because of the suit, the case descriptions were supplied in great detail, and one could read them. And they had the same kinds of non-specific symptoms as the Americans had, mostly headache, dizziness, a whole range of other similar symptoms. Again, with a lot of variability between patient to patient. And some of them had heard sounds, but quite a few of them didn't hear sounds before they had the symptoms. Now, moving on, January of 2018. Now, it's not too surprising, actually, even well before this, when this first came out, Senator Marco Rubio, who from Florida, who is well known to be a critic of the Cuban government, had stated unequivocally that the Cubans were responsible and that they could stop it if they wanted to. In fact, that was the story of most of the U.S. government. Then President Trump said, "I believe that the Cubans are responsible for these attacks." John Kelly, who was the chief of staff, said the Cubans are responsible and they can stop it if they want to. So there was a clear indication that the U.S. government felt that the Cubans were the culprits. in this particular meeting, this was so Senator Rubio is the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and there was an open meeting in January of 2018 to discuss this problem and to, of course, interview people and try to get to the bottom of it. And at that point, Rubio said it's a fact that the Cubans were either directly or indirectly responsible for the attacks, because there was now some feeling of, well, maybe the Cubans were working with the Russians or possibly even the Chinese rather than themselves, because this required maybe more than the Cubans were able to do on their own. Interestingly, during this session, Senator Rubio ridiculed the Cuban government's report. Now, I mentioned the Cuban government had this report where they got their scientists together, did all this searching and reviewing. They could find no evidence of any kind of exposure, and they could not find any evidence of an attack. They, at the end of the final conclusion, was that they don't know for sure what it was, but they were wondering whether it might be some type of a psychogenic illness, a type of mass psychogenic illness. And of course, this was immediately dismissed and made people very upset. And Rubio responded to this. And when he interviewed people, he suggested that you're not indicating that these people are making it up, colluding together to make up symptoms. These are not hypochondriacs. And the method of his questioning suggested that, first of all, he had no knowledge at all about psychogenic illness, but he was ridiculing them for even suggesting the possibility of psychogenic illness, at least as a factor in this. It is interesting at this meeting is Senator Jeff Flake, who you probably remember as Senator, Republican Senator from Arizona, was upset or concerned that Rubio kept saying attacks and that the people had been attacked. And he said there really is no evidence for an attack. And of course, this caused Rubio to get very upset with him, questioning his loyalty and suggesting that he just didn't know what he was talking about. But Flake brought up the point that the FBI had looked into this and found no evidence of any attack. But this was at the point, had not been come out officially at that point. So this turmoil within the government, at the same time, we're seeing Havana Syndrome starts to move out of Cuba and spread around the world. And again, I'm going to be coming back to fill in some of these gaps a little later on. But at this point, I just want to give an overview. So first, remarkably, it was in Uzbekistan, where an embassy staff member and his wife was evacuated because of what was thought to be Havana Syndrome. Similar situations, some sounds, and then having a variety of symptoms. But soon after, a large number of embassy employees at multiple areas within China, then Russia, and then it just rapidly spread. Germany, France, Great Britain, even in Washington, D.C., people complained that they were having symptoms due to Havana Syndrome. Now, another interesting point at this is what about non-embassy cases? In the very beginning, right after the press release, the Associated Press reported that they had a large number of tourists contact and said they think they had developed Havana Syndrome when they were in Havana around the same time and had stayed at these hotels where some of the embassy people had stayed. And the AP at request from the government, what should they tell these people? And then the government told them, well, tell them they should see their family doctor, but they're really not interested in non-embassy cases. And it's really obvious that there have been many, many cases. I get emails fairly regularly from people who are sure they have Havana syndrome, and they want to know how they can get a diagnosis and what they can do about it. But we have this very unusual situation where it is really only Havana syndrome if you're an employee of an embassy of the U.S. Government or possibly some other government. So, but this is something, again, I will come back to. Another change that was occurring around this time, this was again in 2018, was the idea of a sonic weapon. There was a strong negative reaction to that. How could a sonic weapon damage the brain? We know if the sound's loud enough, you can damage hearing. That's definitely well known. But the reports were not that the sound was that loud, and I'm going to get into more details on getting that. But on top of that, it damaged the brain, causing these brain-like symptoms without any other effect, just didn't make sense. And many people pointed that out. So there was a change in that people said, well, maybe it was not a sonic weapon, but a microwave or a radio wave or electromagnetic wave, which are all these microwaves are electromagnetic waves. That was somehow a weapon was developed that could damage the brain without affecting the skin or the skull outside. And that this sounds like something the Russians might have. That was one of the leading thoughts. But the idea of a microwave weapon was replacing the idea of a sonic weapon. So we're going to fast forward now, and then I'll go back again, as I said. But so we're in 2021, U.S. Congress passes a bill to compensate Havana syndrome victims. And the Havana syndrome victims are to receive between $100,000 and $200,000 apiece. Now, one of the problems, of course, is nobody, certainly I don't know of anybody who knows how to make a diagnosis of Havana syndrome. There are no definitive criteria, and so it's going to be very difficult to be able to make a diagnosis. In fact, I mean, based on simply the terminology, it's not a syndrome. The syndrome suggests it's a very characteristic combination of symptoms that tend to occur with a certain pattern and with a time course that is in common, and it tends to follow the same time course. Now, syndromes, we often don't know the cause, but at least they have to have those common features. Whereas in this case, as I mentioned, markedly different symptoms are reported, and the time course was very variable. Some would have acute symptoms and get better. Others would have acute and then they'd become chronic. Others had delayed symptoms, came on later on. So this was going to be a real problem, how to decide who has it. Again, I'll come around to that. By this current year, 2023, news reports and such indicate that there are more than 1,500 U.S. embassy employees in over 90 countries who have Havana syndrome. And again, how this was determined or what the criteria, that's not clear, but that's the magnitude of the problem. Now, again, fast forward to March of 2023, and out comes a report from 5 separate U.S. intelligence agencies announcing that the results of the investigation that they had conducted of what they called anonymous health incidents. Now, they're replacing Havana syndrome with this, which for AHI for short, or anonymous health incidents, because they recognize that it really isn't a clear syndrome, and it's very hard to define exactly what it is. So this is the term they decided to use, and this term had been floating around, had been used on occasion, but this is now what the government, at least the intelligence agency, were calling Havana Syndrome, anomalous health incidents. They could find no evidence of attacks, and they felt that the symptoms could be explained by pre-existing conditions, conventional illness, environmental factors, and hypervigilance. Now, this to some, this seemed to be startling news. In fact, I think I'll just read a few sentences from this just to give the flavor. 5 agencies judged that available intelligence consistently points against the involvement of U.S. adversaries in causing the reported incidents. Agencies employed an array of collection and investigative efforts that spanned hundreds of reported incidents within the United States and abroad, and explored a range of potential indicators of hostile activity, from identifying suspicious persons near incident sites to searching for a pattern among affected personnel. These efforts could not identify an adversary or as being responsible for any incident, and in some cases, intelligence agencies and partners had comprehensive information on the location where an AHI, or this anomalous health incident or Havana Syndrome episode, occurred, but found no evidence of adversary activity. And they then go on to say that they interviewed and reviewed the data on hundreds of individuals from all of these different locations who claimed to have had Havana Syndrome. And they felt that they could explain in the great majority of them, based on, as I mentioned, their pre-existing conditions, conventional illness, environmental factors, and hypervigilance. Now, as I'll get into shortly, this is to myself and to my co-author, Dr. Robert Bartholomew, who wrote a book on Havana Syndrome, published in 2020. This is exactly what we had concluded at that time. And as I'll get into, I'll describe the facts. So it was not that surprising to us, but I think it certainly has been surprising to others, but it certainly is not by any means accepted by many people. Certainly the press has not really accepted this so far. It's certainly coming around to some degree. The lawyers for the various victims are very upset with this and have attacked it. But let me go on now and just briefly tell you how I got involved in this. I'm already a little behind my schedule, so I'm going to have to move on a little faster. But so I first heard about this in late 2017, like everybody else, in reading the newspaper, reading in the Los Angeles Times, an article saying that victims of a sonic attack in Cuba had a whole range of symptoms. They had brain damage, some had ear damage, and it really was startling. I mean, it was very difficult to understand. The first question I had, of course, too, was why would Cuba want to do this? What would be the benefit to them? And then what type of a sonic weapon could do this? I've worked in this area for a long time. It didn't make any sense at all to me. So while I'm reading these various newspaper articles, beginning of January of 2018, I received a manuscript to review from the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, that was submitted by the group of researchers at the Brain Trauma Center at University of Pennsylvania, describing the results of their studies on 21 patients who were referred there for evaluation of Havana Syndrome symptoms. Now, these were 16 of the original group that were referred from Miami, and then another additional 5 were subsequently referred on. So their study consisted of 21 such patients. And so I was thinking, my goodness, now I'm going to get some real answers, some real scientific data on what's going on. But unfortunately, that was not the case. Essentially, what they did is reported 21 case reports. They described what they said was a probable sonic weapon, but provided no details about it, hinted that the government had information, but it was top secret and could not be given out at that time. They indicated, and the study showed they did hearing tests on these patients, and the hearing was normal, except in 2 patients that had pre-existing hearing loss. So despite the fact that there had been complaints of hearing loss, objective hearing tests showed no hearing loss. And indeed, hearing tests, audiometric testing, is one of the most reliable and controlled type of testing we have in this area. The other thing was MRIs of the brain scans that had been suggested showed abnormalities in the white matter tract abnormalities. Of the 21, 2 had mild changes and 1 had moderate changes. And indeed, these types of changes are seen in any group of normal people. They occur with normal aging. They occur commonly in people with migraine, and even in this random population. And the authors admitted that the MRI scans of the brain were within normal limits. These were non-specific findings of little consequence. They had a bunch of different functional tests, neuropsychological tests and eye tracking tests that they suggested indicated brain damage, and that these people had concussion-like symptoms, and even they can't use the term concussion without a concussion. Now, the tests they were using are not specific for concussion. This I can tell you for sure. They are, as I say, functional testing. And what immediately was apparent, their statistics and how they were using them were very questionable, and I felt flawed. The bottom line is I recommended that the article not be published. I felt that there were really too many flaws within it in terms of the data and the conclusions. But as it often happens, it was published. And there was some immediate backlash in that there was an editorial by 2 neurologists that raised some of the questions that I had and that we raised in our book. But the backlash was delayed, and over the next several months, many letters to the editor and other comments came in. One of the key was from Dr. Sergio Della Sala, who's the editor of the journal Cortex, a journal. It's a journal, neuropsychological journal, and Dr. Della Sala and the entire editorial board of Cortex wrote to the editors of JAMA and suggested that the data was highly flawed, and that the criteria that they had used to determine abnormality was such that just about everybody would be abnormal, including the editors of the journal of the American Medical Association themselves. And they asked for more information from the authors on how they did the tests and the statistics used. And when the authors responded, they felt the group at Cortex said that it was even more confusing, and they recommended that the article should be retracted. Now, the next thing that happened in terms of my information about the study was when I was sent another article to review in the spring of that year. And this one was submitted to the New England Journal of Medicine. It was from the group in Miami, in which they studied 25 patients. Many of these were the same patients that the group in University of Pennsylvania studied. And one of the remarkable things is it came out shortly after that there was a feud developing and had developed between the group at University of Pennsylvania and University of Miami, so that the University of Miami group refused or wanted their names removed from the initial paper that was submitted to JAMA because they did not feel they were given adequate access to the data. So they said, okay, we'll publish our own article, and they sent it off to New England Journal of Medicine, as I say, in March or April of that year. I don't recall exactly, but describing 25 patients with this syndrome. And they focused on audio vestibular testing, although they also found that the hearing tests were normal, except for the two people that I had mentioned. But they reported that all of the patients showed abnormalities on otolith ocular function and vestibular testing. Now, this is an area that I've worked on throughout my entire academic career. And one of the things that I can tell you for sure is we do not have an adequate or reliable test of otolith ocular or otolith function. We have tests, they show great normal variability, and they're certainly not reliable in any single individual. But they claim that all of them had abnormalities on this test, and therefore these patients had inner ear damage to explain their symptoms and not brain damage. Now, one cannot help but see the fact that these are ENT physicians in Miami who are finding ear damage to explain the syndrome, and the Brain Trauma Center finds brain trauma as the cause of the syndrome. So, based on this, in this case, it was straightforward. I said this is really bad science. This should not be published. Two other reviewers that reviewed the same paper said, I totally agreed completely. This should not be published. It was turned down by the New England Journal of Medicine. And then they published it later at the end of that year in a ENT journal that Michael Hoffer was on the editorial board. And the article was published. And not surprisingly, when each of these articles were published, the media had, again, multiple headlines saying evidence of brain damage. Doctors find evidence of brain damage. Doctors find evidence of ear damage as the cause of this. Based on that experience, and then in discussions I had with Dr. Robert Bartholomew, a sociologist in New Zealand, about this problem, we started to work on a book to try to get at the details. And so the book we worked on through 2019, and we published it in 2020, January 2020. And the basic premise of the book was there was no evidence of attacks to explain the symptoms, and that the symptoms could be explained by a combination of pre-existing conditions and psychogenic illness or psychosomatic symptoms. All right, getting late, but I'm going to have to move faster here. Just a few, the Jason reports, it's remarkable. I think that it would be negligent of me to go into this story without bringing up these two reports. These were conducted by the Jason group, which is a group of scientists who perform these types of studies. The U.S. government sponsored the studies, and with the goal of finding out what was going on. And the key thing here is, with both of these reports, you had scientists with backgrounds that were critical to understanding this. They were scientists with auditory, audiology backgrounds, physics, all the appropriate medical specialties. And the first report was completed in 2018. And that report focused on the original group, essentially the 21 that were reported by the University of Pennsylvania study. And their whole focus was on the possibility of a sonic weapon and what was it that people were hearing and what were they experiencing. Remarkably, of the first 21 people that had the episodes, 8 of them recorded the sound on a recording machine. One of them actually was even on a FaceTime conversation when an attack occurred, and so they were able to see that there was no effect on electronic devices in the area, what the sound was like, and so forth. But they had auditory experts examine these tapes, and they concluded that they were all consistent with the sounds of crickets, and that was the best explanation for the sounds that the people recorded. And now they said, these are the sounds we heard before we had the symptoms. And the experts concluded that these sounds were nothing like any kind of a sonic weapon. They weren't that loud. There was no way this could be the cause of anything. They also addressed the issue of infrasound and ultrasound, so sound wave above and below the hearing level. Could any of that be involved? And their conclusion was that a sonic weapon did not make sense. It just didn't fit and was not at all likely. They also even speculate too that at that point there was a question of the microwave microwave weapon, but that was just early stages. They didn't focus on that, but they thought that was not likely. It's interesting though that the report was not released, and it was not released until September of 2021, when a reporter for BuzzFeed, Dan Ferragamo, who I'd been in communication with, in fact, he sent it to me to look at and to review when he finally got it. And when it was finally released, it made no sense to me why it was not released immediately, but the government did not want to release it. They had to get it through the Freedom of Information Act. The second Jason report was completed in October of 2021, and this one was much more thorough, and it was much more consistent with the response and report of the multi-intelligence agency report that I mentioned earlier. They looked at large numbers of people from all different countries. They also focused in on the microwave issue and found that did not make sense. First of all, you see, microwaves, we know how they work, and they cook, they heat tissue, they damage tissue if they get heated enough. But you can't cook the brain without cooking the skin and in the face first. I mean, the closest example we have that we could explain what a microwave is like is light waves. It's just it's a micro electromagnetic wave, but with a little longer wavelength. But it would be the same as trying to cook the brain with intense light from the sun without touching the skin or the skull. It's just not going to happen. And there was no evidence of any objective brain damage on MRI of the brain. So the idea that microwaves are somehow damaged the brain, they felt did not make any sense. And the other thing is they concluded as well, when they interviewed all of the different people with, in quotes, Havana Syndrome from around the world, that most of them could be explained based on either pre-existing symptoms or psychogenic-like symptoms. There was a small group that they said of several, like I think it was a couple of hundred, a small group under 20 that they could not explain, but they didn't, it's not likely that you could explain every single one of these. But the vast majority, and they went in great detail looking at all records and all information. So the Jason reports, again, not much reported. And I'm running out of time. I'm seeing, so what I'm going to end with this. I'm not going to have time to go into some of the other things. But again, for those who want to, follow up on this in terms of references and also a lot of examples of other things in the past where this has happened, our book on Havana Syndrome, you can look at it there. But finally, and I get this asked about this a lot, and this is a difficult. What about the National Academy of Science report? The National Academy of Science got together a committee that looked at this problem now about a year and a half or 2 years ago, and asked to come up with a conclusion, and they reviewed this. Now, interesting, be aware, this was during COVID, and they actually did this essentially as a literature search and a Zoom kind of meetings. But they, after going through the entire process, they concluded that it was most likely due to a microwave attack. Despite saying that we don't have any objective evidence for such an attack, but that is our conclusion, that it was probably a microwave attack. And one of the reasons was they felt there's what's called a fry effect, which is when microwaves can cause some clicking-like sounds in the ear by direct stimulation of the auditory end organ and nerve. So it's not really a sound, but it's a perception of a sound. And so they thought that explains the sounds, this fry effect. Now, of course, they ignored the fact that people were recording the sound. So if you record it, it can't be a perception of a sound. It was an actual sound that was recorded. One of the rather remarkable things is that they apparently did not have either of the Jason reports. Of course, one had been withheld and the other hadn't been completed at that time, apparently. So they didn't have any of that information when this was decided. But that, of course, is still being thrown around as how, the National Academy of Science says it was a microwave attack. And that's one of the leading considerations amongst those who want to believe in an attack. I'm afraid that, I'm going to have to stop here. I've gone over. Mark, I'll let you now maybe take over and we can have a few minutes of questions. I'm sorry I got tied up with all of these things.
No worries, Dr. Baloh. Thanks so much for that presentation. I will field.
I'm sorry, Gavin. Gavin's
questions. Yeah, no problem. I'll field the questions. So we've got 3 questions or comments, and I will direct them to you in the order that we got them. And I think they'll give you some chance to maybe expound on some of the ideas you didn't get a chance to get to. So we'll start with Sana Isfahani asking, was there any expansion of the syndrome effects to FBI agents? She has a patient who's a former FBI agent who believes that she was attacked in Hawaii. So any sense of people beyond embassy, like FBI agents in particular?
I suspect, although that, as far as I know, I don't know of any specific instance, but several intelligence agents of the CIA, and whether even it's possible that some FBI agents, I honestly don't know.
Sure. Want to be somewhere digging with that patient. This is a comment from Ahmed Jalian that I think you can kind of relate to your own work. Starts off with expressing some gratitude for the work that you've done. Hi, Bob. Thank you for all your body of work and the great talk. We published a paper on Havana Syndrome in 2020, where we compared the complaints of all the published series from the staff tested at Miami and Penn and compared it to 100 patients with vestibular migraine. We found that the incidence of their symptoms in the 2 groups were identical in all but one symptom of acute head pressure. Interestingly, the Penn group treated them with migraine prophylactics, such as TCA beta blockers. Do you have comments on that kind of exploration?
That is really an interesting, and I had planned on getting into that migraine. And a migraine, first of all, as an example of a psychogenic illness and symptom, and as the fact that many of these people actually said, look, it caused me to have a migraine, or I had a migraine as a result of the noise, or that was my symptom. I had a migraine. So migraine is a very interesting condition, and in it, as I didn't have time to go into psychogenic illness, and that would be another talk, I guess. I thought I could bring it in this, but actually, Oliver Sacks, one of the famous neurology writers of all time, he wrote Awakening and several very best-selling books. One of his early books was Migraine, and he said that migraine is the prototypic psychosomatic illness or psychogenic illness. Everybody knows that if you have a tendency to migraine, stress will trigger an episode. If you're anxious, you can have an episode. Relaxation tends to help it. Now, on the other hand, some think and call migraine a genetic disease. We know there are many genetic susceptibility factors that make certain people more likely to get migraine symptoms than others. But that's exactly the way psychogenic illness is. It's complicated. It's certainly by no means is it imagining symptoms. These are psychogenic symptoms are as real as any symptoms that you can have from anything, a brain tumor, anything. The same brain pathways are activated. And in some cases, of course, you're probably triggering migraine in a susceptible person. And what is behind mass psychogenic illness? Usually it occurs in stressful situations, stress. And stress, we know, affects the brain. Release of adrenaline, release of cortisol. You can affect your brain in many ways. So that indeed, I'm sure that some of these people had migraine. And as that question brings out, which is also not recognized by many people, migraine is not a headache. Headache is the most common symptom, but dizziness is right next. Mostly all migraine patients have dizziness at their times. Many will have discrete episodes of vertigo, isolated episodes of vertigo. And indeed, when I first was reviewing these cases in the first paper, I said, well, my goodness, I see this every day in my clinic. These are cases of either migraine or the other one, which is very common, was this condition called persistent postural perceptual dizziness, PPPD, another psychogenic illness of dizziness, brain fog. These patients are dizzy 24/7 for years, months. They feel brain fog. They have multiple other similar symptoms, but many of the patients fit exactly into that pattern. So the patients did fit into patterns, but to blame it on an attack, I think doesn't do them any good, because the one thing you don't want to do when you have psychogenic symptoms in someone like this complaining of them is to say you have brain damage, because we know that's the way to make it worse in the long run. And if they're not going to get better, the chances of them getting better, they need reassurance. They need to be addressed like any other patient. They need to have testing to be sure that things are not being missed. Identify what you can, but don't tell you have brain damage, because that is a signature of a long chronic illness. One of the most dramatic, outbreaks of psychosomatic and mass psychogenic illness in the history of the world was shell shock during World War I. And certainly many of the people did initially were around exploding shells and did have concussive effect, but 95% and above were subsequently shown to be psychogenic. And just the stress and the fear of the war and all of the stress associated with it brought out this. But what they did learn, and it was very dramatic, if you sent them back behind the lines to a trauma center, brain trauma center, many of them were invalids for the rest of their life, or they had chronic symptoms that persisted. Whereas if they were worked up and reassured and given supportive care, many of them got better. And I think the same thing can be said for this situation.
So I think what you just said really dovetails nicely with our next comment from Hale Farbot. And Hale, thank you for your presentation or participation in all of these similar discussions we've had. And so you might not have much to say, but just because it's very much aligned, these symptoms can be explained by the vulnerability of individuals who are prone to anxiety disorders under long-term stress and anxiety-provoking conditions, such as being under surveillance and the constant expectation of threat. The MRI of those real cases perhaps should also show a reduction in hippocampus volume and possibly an enlargement of the amygdala.
Well, yeah, I can't disagree with the problem with, and this is a good point. You're not going to identify that in a single person. That's the problem. If you look at group comparisons, you might be able to see these. This is one of the things with all of the. There was some functional MRI studies that were reported on these patients, but it's these kind of studies are made to be looked at in group comparisons. But in an individual case, there's too much variability to make any kind of definitive kind of statements. But there's absolutely no question that stress can change your brain. I've become very much involved in this. I had a book after Havana Syndrome that addresses this. It's essentially what happens to the brain with psychogenic illness, both in terms of organic and psychological effects on it. But there are massive organic changes, and definitely, just as you said, there's shrinkage of the hippocampus. But of course, all of those same things happen with depression, and with many other psychogenic-like illnesses. There are changes, and certainly large changes in the brain. Sometimes the changes are more dramatic than you could see with some terrible brain disease. So that I think that we have this misperception, and that's what I kept seeing throughout this in my interactions with the politicians and with others, that psychogenic illness is some kind of a fake. People are making it up. There's collusion. This is a big problem because many doctors have that perception as well. It's not just the lay public, the media, politicians, but many doctors even believe that it only occurs in women. That they're only in weak people. All of those kinds of misconceptions has made this extremely difficult, and of course people that they don't want to be anywhere associated with psychogenic. These are real. I'm having symptoms. They are, and they need to be treated as though they're having symptoms, but it's not. They don't have a brain trauma. That's the key thing. There's no sign of brain trauma.
Yeah, I was about to say, well said. Thank you. And we've got a few more questions that have come in, so I'll try to get through them in the time we have left. But Alex Cox wants to know, what are some of these other examples of this or similar syndromes that you mentioned that you didn't get a chance to get into?
Well, again, there's many, and that's more than half our book is addressing these, and it's great detailed referencing to it. But starting with the witch trials in the 17th century, with the young women becoming sick and blaming it on people, women in the village who they didn't like or had treated them badly, and leading to the deaths of thousands of people who were claimed to be witches. That's some extreme example. But I think one of the key things is there's a tremendous variation in so-called mass psychogenic. The ones we hear about is the most common is schoolgirls. A bunch of schoolgirls, one smells something or tastes something. The famous one was the Coca-Cola scare in Belgium, where a schoolgirl there drank some Coca-Cola, it tasted funny, it spread throughout her whole school. Before long, all throughout Belgium, all throughout Europe, Coca-Cola was removed from all of the stores throughout Europe. People were having all kinds of illnesses and attributed chronic illnesses to it. And eventually it was determined that it was all psychogenic. There was some sulfite in one of the batches of that gave it a little funny smell that may have been a trigger, although even that wasn't sure. But there's example, but that's the one that people, of schoolgirls being, because weak women, girls, that still is, basing back to this old idea of hysteria, mass hysteria. Well, that's why we dropped that, because it has historical baggage that's wrong. More common or examples there's a thing they're called the hum. And people that hear the hum are the hummers. This has been going around the world for a couple of many decades, back into the 60s, where people will hear a humming sound and then they get sick. And in cities, it occurred in cities in Bristol, England. The famous one was Taos, New Mexico, where the people could hear this and they would get sick. They brought in a team of investigators. In fact, the U.S. government sponsored these investigators come in for 2 weeks. The scientists could not find the sound. They recorded and did it. They could not find the sound. And it had a lot of these unusual features, like in this case, where it's in one place but not in another. Somebody in a room hears it, another person doesn't hear it. And the symptoms are very variable. But then that's where there were cities all around the United States and Canada where this would be outbreaks of this. It would last for weeks and sometimes months at a time. So there's huge number, thousands of examples in different areas. A lot with sounds, like acoustic shock with early telephones. The telephone operators that would complain of being sick from listening to the sounds that they listen to all day, and that spread throughout whole groups of telephone operators. What's interesting about this, it'll start in one group or some few people, and then it'll spread through that group. But you can have another group just across town who would have 0 affected cases, and then have this entire population affected in one area. So it tends to spread as the media, politics get involved, doctors. All of this can lead to framing of how people perceive this. The human brain is not like a computer that lays down traces in nice, clean memory tracks. Everything we learn, it's altered by what we previously knew, by our beliefs. We change connectivity, but we have all this affected by what our prior beliefs are. And so it's very easy for our ideas and our memories to be affected by what we think and believe.
Sure. I want to pause. We've got a few more questions, and I want to ask if we have time, even if we go over for a bit, for our guest and our director, if it's worthwhile to ask just 1 or 2 more questions to get your thoughts on. I see a nod from our director. Dr. Baloh, if you're good with that, I'll
I'm fine.
ask you a couple more. So Geraldo Farrington says, mahalo for your careful work on this phenomenon. What has happened lately with further reports of Havana Syndrome in Cuba and around the world?
What has happened lately, did he say?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the most, as I say, the most recent would be the report I mentioned by the 5. This is, I think, the most dramatic, the Interagency Intelligence Community Assessment report. I have it actually in front of me. It's from March 1st, 2023. This was in most of the papers, but again, it's remarkable. It's hard to change people's ideas. There's, most of the reports I see, and still on TV, there'll be sections that they completely ignore that. It's not even mentioned, or there's still a very large segment of medical population, of certainly the media, the government, who believe these attacks occurred. In fact, as I said, we're in a situation where we're supposed to be reimbursing people with this, and I don't know how we're going to come up with a diagnosis on the Twitter accounts. People have been asking about how do I get a diagnosis of Havana syndrome, and the leading answer is go to see Dr. Michael Hoffer in the University of Miami. So we're in a situation where there's going to be, Havana syndrome doctors, like there are Lyme doctors, like chronic fatigue doctors. We have a very difficult getting any kind of consensus. But historically, with outbreaks like this, it takes years often. And even then, it's hard to convince, certainly convincing the individuals. That's the hardest one.
Sure. And we'll close with this question from Kathleen Powers. Thank you for this talk. One of the arguments in the talk for this being a psychosomatic disease, as I've understood it, is that injury must be caused to the skin or connective tissue before neurological injury can occur. A recent study showed that even the radiation from smartphones and wireless headphones can cause cardiac pacemakers to change modes, reverting to magnet mode. The research on radiation from cell phones and tumors is mixed, but I'm curious, what are your thoughts on electromagnetic radiation and brain damage?
My thoughts are you cannot damage the brain with electromagnetic waves without damaging the tissue, the skin, the skull. I mean, if you put something in a microwave oven, can you cook the center of it without affecting the periphery? Certainly microwaves can affect electronic equipment and such. And if you had enough energy in microwaves, you could cook the brain. There's no question about that. But one of the biggest problems, and it's totally ignored by the people who make the argument for microwaves, is we know there have been instances of microwave exposure, of high energy microwaves, and it does cause, the first thing it does start to cook. It cooks the tissue and it heats it up. So people complain, they feel hot, they get sweat, their heart rate goes up. They have a completely different clinical syndrome than these people with Havana Syndrome are reporting. And so if you had enough energy, certainly you could damage the brain with any electromagnetic wave. The problem is to go through the skin and skull, damage the brain tissue, and have normal MRI and no evidence of skin or, now people have argued, there may be some secret weapon, but experts do not come up with any weapon that I've seen.
Appreciate that. We want to thank all of our audience members or participants for your engagement, and thank you to everyone that submitted a question. Apologize that we couldn't get through every question, but I think this is a great additional contextualization for Dr. Baloh's work and remarks. And so I want to thank you, Dr. Baloh, for such an interesting presentation, for your ongoing work on this. And I want to give it to Mark Fisher for our closing comments. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
I want to thank Professor Baloh for his outstanding presentation today. And I want to thank those who have worked behind the scenes to make this event possible. Isabella Caitlin, Cheryl Cotman, and Stephen Gahn from the Center for Neuropolitics, Jessica Banfield and Joanna Wu from UCI School of Medicine, and our fantastic media director, Will Alvarez. Thanks to Dr. Akira Shiyama at UCLA for assistance with this event. And thanks to you, the audience, for your engagement and your enthusiasm. The next UCI Center for Neuropolitics event will be this fall, when we have our annual symposium. This year's topic will be Conspiracy Thinking in American Politics. So please be on the lookout for more information on this event. And as I say goodbye, I look forward to seeing you again in the fall.